Welcome, everybody, to Faithful Dissent yet again. Today we have with us Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor, a teacher and sometimes tweeter, who is is joining us today to talk about life in the Evangelical Church. So thank you, Karen, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I wanted to kind of start out with some things that I don't know, and maybe some of our listeners know. Like, how did you become a Christian, and how did you end up in the church?
Well, my parents were relatively new believers when I was little, and growing up in New England, most people in New England that long ago who went to church were most likely to be Methodist.
Mm.
My grandparents were Methodist and my mother grew up in the Methodist church. And so I was dedicated as a baby in the Methodist church. But then they started to attend Little Country Baptist Church. And when I was about 5, I believe, but I remember praying to Jesus when I was 5 years old and he was already my savior. I just remember the
Mm.
prayer and I already knew him as my savior. But I think when I was about 7 or 9 in this Baptist church is when I chose to be baptized. And so for me, that is kind of the moment. It wasn't the moment of my salvation, but it's the moment that I look to where I had that assurance of my seal in Christ. So I grew up in a Christian home and, went to mainly little country churches and went to Sunday school and taught Sunday school by the time I was 12 years old. And yeah, so had my little forays into teenage rebellion and so forth, but I never really had a crisis of faith.
Yeah.
Yeah, so when I was being disobedient, I knew I was being disobedient. So,
Was it?
but I also knew I was saved, so,
It was all good.
Win-win.
It was a
Win-win.
win-win, yeah.
Win-win. So, was it Independent Baptist, Southern Baptist,
Yeah,
the
so
1623 Baptist?
Yeah. So so my family moved around a little bit, so it gets a little bit confusing. But that church where I was baptized was an American Baptist church. Again,
Okay.
in the
Yeah.
Northeast, there weren't a lot of Southern Baptist churches then. I think, there are now. But also, interestingly enough, and this is getting a little bit ahead of the story, but the pastor in that little tiny country church, Baptist church, started taking correspondence courses from an upstart college in Virginia called Liberty Bible Institute or Baptist Institute or something like that. And so even at that early age, my world was coming into contact with, what would become Liberty University, where I would eventually go to teach and all that. Um, so those connections were starting to, this is, circa 1970, mid 1970s, just to place it in time. And so but then as we moved around a little bit more and I actually, got married young, I'm still married 40 years later to the same guy. So when we
How young were you?
19.
19.
19.
That's awesome.
And so when we married and started church life, there were 2 Bible churches that we went to. They were called Bible churches.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so they were, independent. But if you looked at their statement of faith and all of those things, they were straight out of Baptist.
So what was if you were to describe, if I was an anthropologist coming in and saying, what was church like? What did it feel like? What did it mean to be a Christian when you were young? What was that flavor like?
Yeah, it was simple and homey. Definitely, I had 2 older brothers and I think I don't think my parents, I have memories of me going to church. They were older, but they weren't necessarily there. So I think my parents encouraged us to go to church, but didn't force us. But sometimes I just felt like, I got a little bored sometimes, but I still wanted to go. And I liked the churches, even if I was making fun of the minister in my mind. And I was sitting
Brian's
there.
worst nightmare.
Yeah, no, I have a little passage in my memoir, which is, it's an older book of mine that's my first one actually called Booked, Literature and the Soul of Me, and I talk about this. And I was also growing up in New England. I didn't know any other Christians. Like the kids I went to
Hmm.
school, I went to public school.
Yeah.
New England is a very, sort of post-Christian
And it was
culture.
even in the 70s?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
Okay.
was. Yeah. I found out later, you reconnect with all your old schoolmates through Facebook, which you never really expect to happen, but it happens. I found out later some of my classmates, I mean, I went to a very small school, were Christians, but I just didn't, those weren't the ones I hung out with, So, and now we're friendly with each other, but my friends, my small group of friends, and even my cousins that I always played with, and they came to my house, they had to go to church, and when I went to their house, we didn't go to church. So it was a little bit, it was different, but I wasn't like, necessarily, it wasn't bad. It was just, I think I already felt different, and I always did throughout my life for various reasons. I guess since you're getting so personal so quickly, I'll share a little story that I think does encapsulate a lot for me. Even though this was, I'm old enough. I grew up outside of what I would call like, what do they call it? Like, oh, the evangelical
Big
industrial
Eva?
complex and Big Eva, right? This was, I
Yeah.
mean, this was way before that. I experienced that through my students who did grow up in that way. But I do know that somehow I received the message, and I don't think anyone said it to me directly, or maybe they did. My parents certainly weren't this way, but somehow I internalized the message that if you really love Jesus, you will be a pastor or a missionary.
Yes.
Hmm.
And I was a girl. I was not going to be a pastor. And
Hmm.
I was not interested in being a pastor's wife, that's for sure.
Hmm.
I was making fun of the pastors in my mind. They were, poor. God bless them. Um, sorry, Brian.
That's okay.
But here's the other
That's
thing.
fair.
I did not want, like, when I pictured being a missionary and living in some place where, food is scarce and shelter is uncomfortable, all these things, and living, that's what I pictured as a child. I had no interest in doing that. And so I just literally said to myself, well, I guess I don't really love the Lord because I don't want to do any of these things.
Wow.
And so it took me a long, long time. I actually, again, I write about this in my memoir, Booked. It wasn't until I was in my PhD program that I really came to understand how the way I'm made and the passions God gave me and the gifts and skills he gave me for literature and writing and reading, that those can be used to serve the Lord in just as powerful way as any of the other callings, that was my calling and it was good. It just took me that long. And so I didn't reject God. I didn't have the crisis of faith, but I was just like, oh, I guess I'm just going to pursue another path. And I didn't really know how to make God really an integral part of that. So I just kind of went my own way.
It's so fascinating that you said that, because I actually grew up in a charismatic Baptist church, which, if you know anything about churches, is odd. Southern Baptists aren't normally charismatic. And that was very much true. I grew up I was a child in the late 80s and then an adolescent in the 90s. And so that was still very much true. And I definitely absorbed that, was that like you could be special, close to God if you did missions, or were, if you maybe slightly less important if you became a pastor. So missions was the most. That was where you were the theological hero. You were out there. And, if you couldn't do that, you became a pastor. And I definitely absorbed that. And it also, for me, was, it fit with a lot of my giftings. I liked to be around different cultures. I was a good speaker. I liked, talking to people. So it was natural that I was like, oh, this must be how I'm special. This must be what I'm supposed to do. But it's fascinating because you grew up, in a different era than I did, but it was still something in a completely different place in New England. But it was still very much in the air.
Well, I was going to say, and again, this is, in the Evangelical Imagination, one of my more recent books, where I talk about the social imaginary of evangelicalism over the past 300 years since it began. Missions, the rise of the missions movement that took place in the 19th century in the British Empire, when the British Empire
Right.
ruled the globe, right?
Yep, that's right.
It was that grew up alongside evangelicalism, both in the British Isles and in America. And so missions is very intertwined within evangelicalism and evangelical identity. And so, I mean, I think that carried all the way through the 20th century into the 21st century. I think there are some healthy sort of re-examinations of, how to do missions and what it means, and how not to do it. But I just think that idea lasted and is central to, well, it is central to evangelicalism in as much as the Beppington Quadrilateral, which kind of defines evangelicalism, has four components that define the evangelical movement. And one of them is activism, which it primarily meant at that time missions.
Yeah. And I would say today that's not quite the case anymore. Like, I don't think missions is really talked about in the same way, even as it was 15 years ago. I mean, it's still present in a lot of churches, but it seems completely different than, say, it was during the 90s or the early 2000s or the 80s.
Right.
So it's another marker of this big shift. And that might be connected to more, simply the technology has opened up the world. So it's not like there's this exotic place, 10,000 miles away that if we don't go to, then over here anymore. I mean, there's so much interconnection and missionaries going to America from other places, and it's just one big stew now. But I think it is a huge shift. Brian, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's also part of the post-colonial era, right, where we're questioning everything that colonialism did, including missions. So
I was just going to say, I think that evangelical industrial complex has also changed our perspective on missions, where, especially as we've gone to the mega church model, missions becomes less about people on a field that we send out and we bring back, and then we give them a new leisure suit and listen to their slide presentation. But we take teams of people from our church on kind of either short or however terms, short-term mission projects or mission tourism or whatever. But we have kind of turned them into a bit of a cottage industry, both locally, but then even on the field, where we have like missionaries who live in places, but their primary role there is to facilitate those trips of white evangelicals into those foreign spaces, give them a good time, and then send them home again with stories.
Yeah, that does make sense. I mean, the short-term mission movement, I mean, that's a whole topic in and of itself, which leads me to my next question, which was, how did you get involved in evangelicalism? Because you were active a little bit as an activist, and then you became a professor in an evangelical institution. So I'm curious about both of those. Like, how did that develop, and why? Why did you become a professor? Why did you choose that particular path?
Yeah, so this all happened in sort of a tightly compacted time period. So I want to make sure I get the order right. So I majored in English in college, and didn't know what I wanted to do. So just applied to a PhD program and got in, still having no idea what I wanted to do. And at this point, my husband and I were married and going to, again, one of those little Bible churches. But I still had a fairly, I had still compartmentalized, I guess, my professional life and my academic life. I didn't know any academics. All the other women my age in my church were having babies, and I wasn't, because we never were able to. But so I just kept going to school. And so I loved the church. I loved the people, but I just lived a life so different from theirs, especially, everyone else was going to Tupperware parties and baby showers. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I've got to write a paper.
Yeah.
But at the same time, my church was, just very faithful and loving and conservative. And it was through them that I became introduced to the pro-life position. We supported a local pregnancy center, and they did a presentation at our church one night and just radically changed me. And I became like instantaneously pro-life. And so things started to click for me, but there I am in like this liberal secular PhD program, and I'm pro-life, and I was like, and I don't know, I just thought it was fine. And so I did not, my classmates and so forth didn't appreciate that. I mean, I don't know, because
Did you talk about it?
Well, I started protesting at abortion clinics, so
Oh, that's right.
yeah, and
So they found
so
out.
yeah, they found out. And it's still, so I would say that this experience in my graduate program where I was trying to figure out how to use what I believe to be my callings in English literature, but also integrating my faith with the rest of my life in a rather clumsy culture warish way.
Mm,
Um, I came out of it, finished my PhD, and when I went on the job market, by that point, I had been introduced to Christian education, Christian worldview, pro-life activism, all of those things, but I still saw myself, I'd always envisioned myself as being, by that point, when I kind of pulled it together, I thought I would be like a Christian professor in a secular university. Like I'd be the token Christian and I could be a witness to the Lord among all
Mm.
my secular peers. And so I applied to secular schools, I applied to Christian schools as well, and I got interviewed and hired very quickly at Liberty University, and so moved
wow.
down there. But it was like I didn't know what I was going to end up doing. I was open and just assumed I'd end up at a secular school,
And it just happened.
but it just happened. I mean, part of it, like, my husband and I really wanted to move to a warmer climate, and Liberty was really thriving then. And I had learned more about the school. My husband and I had accompanied a youth group trip there while I was in grad school. And it was like, oh, and I was actually really impressed with the school at that time because I saw them integrating literature with the Christian faith in the classes that I visited and the people that I talked to. And I thought that, I mean, and by that point, that's what I wanted to do. And so,
Mm,
yeah, there I
Mm.
went.
Well, and one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this is we've just been thinking about this phenomenon that a lot of people have, which you may share some or in part, but I know for Brian, somewhat for me, but also for my parents, growing up in the Jesus movement and being a part of the evangelical church, which meant so many things. It meant Dr. Dobson's focus on the family. It meant, standing for like moral principles in society, like don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal,
don't dance with girls who do.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't vote for Bill Clinton.
Don't vote for both.
Absolutely not vote.
Yeah,
Yes.
definitely not doing that. But there was, there's parts of that, even at the time were mocked or made fun of or might be hypocritical. But there was also there was this sense of like presentable, respectable, theologically sound, moral Christianity. Where, we have this, we've thought about this. We've, come up with the best theology to think about this. We're serious about our faith and loving. Like, I remember I grew up in a Southern Baptist church in North Carolina in the 90s. And, people today think about all the changes in race relations that have happened. But in the 90s, it's not like we were a woke church by any stretch of the imagination, but we were very much forward with God loves all people the same. No race is superior to any other race. Let's learn about all the wonderful things God is doing in this other country. Let's take like in the missions program in my Southern Baptist church, they took anthropology seriously. They were like, it wasn't like an anti-intellectual type of tradition. It was, no, we're going to learn how to actually be culturally sensitive to these folks when we go over there. And we believe the gospel is the way that people can know Jesus and know faith and have eternal life. But we're not going to like run ramshot over their culture. It was, the Gospel Coalition represents kind of the epitome of this, like maybe 10, 20 years ago when it was first founded, was this very conservative, complementarian take on theology, but very academic. I don't know of a better way to say it, and that, especially, like, I'll just talk just from people I know in my own family, when the turn came in the kind of starting in the early 2010s, but accelerating with the MAGA movement and Trump, where all of a sudden, all the people that you've respected your entire life start saying things that are completely counter to everything they've said before. Like William Bennett writes a book about virtue and then endorses Donald Trump for president.
I still have that book, the first edition. Yes.
Yeah, and then endorses Donald Trump. And I think there's been this disillusionment where people are trying to figure out, what was I doing and who was I doing it with? So anyway, I'm just like curious, where does that fit into your story? Do you see that, and what are the things for you that stood out in that process?
Yeah, that's a good, sort of description of that history. One thing I left out of my own story from your last question about kind of like what happened to me how did I come to identify as evangelical? At the end of my PhD program, when you have to write a dissertation, I was going to write about one thing, and through my research, discovered something else that I ended up writing my dissertation on, and that something else was an obscure writer who wrote one novel. The novel was my chosen area of research and writing, and this obscure 18th to 19th century woman novelist that I discovered was Hannah More, who was a friend of William Wilberforce, an evangelical, a social reformer, a writer, and an abolitionist. That is when I discovered David Bebbington's framing of evangelicalism that, covers these 300 centuries, and also discovered in Hannah More and Wilberforce and their friends known as the Clapham sect, a group of evangelicals who were what you just described, who were wanted to bring about social change, wanted to change the world, but did it with abundant resources, whether it was Moore's literary skills or Wilberforce's parliamentary skills or the banker John Thornton's money. They all work together in an intelligent and compassionate way to bring not just the applications and implications of the gospel to their country and to the rest of the world. And they were evangelicals. And I was like, oh, because I had never grown up using that term. I was just Baptist Christian. But I was like, okay, this is the history that I'm part of. And I want to embrace this history. And so that is when I understood the history of evangelicalism, or began to understand it and embrace that identity. And that is what I thought it was, even through those years that you described. Especially, I was in my 20s, still in grad school when Bill Clinton ran for president, or maybe I don't remember what year that was, but somewhere in that period.
Yeah.
And again, I just thought evangelicals were so right and so righteous and so good to call him out on his moral failures. And, little did I know that, that was just the cover for just, being a shill for the Republican Party, as we would later find out. So, and then, it wasn't until even after I was at Liberty that I learned, I think it had been out for a few years, but I learned about Mark Knoll's book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. So I just started learning more about our recent history. I was immersed in the 18th and 19th century history of evangelicalism. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. What happened? But there was a sort of Billy Graham type of evangelicalism that was very winsome. And now here I am, along with so many other people, saying, wait, what was really going on then? And how did, because it was obviously going on then, and we're just seeing where it led now, but trying to figure out, what did we miss? Where did it go wrong? Because it wasn't all bad, obviously, but it wasn't all good either.
Well, and that's what I'm curious about, is when did you start to notice? Like, what were the things to you? Like, do you remember the first time you were like, wait, there's something different than what I thought? Do you remember when that was?
That's a great question. So when I went to Liberty, of course, I knew who Jerry Falwell was, and I knew he was more fundamentalist than I was. He did identify as a fundamentalist, and even the school did, and then it intentionally shifted to be evangelical. So I knew about that, and I knew that the school overall was probably more conservative than I was socially and politically. I'm not theologically. Theologically, I thought I was on the same page. I don't know where the lines between those things. I guess theologically, I don't know, but because it's all so blurred now. So I didn't expect to fit in completely at Liberty, but I also didn't fit in my liberal secular graduate school,
Right,
So
yeah,
I never.
You
So
used to
it's
be
just
an
like, oh, okay,
outsider.
yeah, exactly. I'm like, okay, I'm a conservative in this space. I'm liberal in this space. Whatever. It's I'm just
Just here to teach.
yeah, and but I still was on board with the mission and had a good experience there. But I was there for the statements that Jerry Falwell made about 9/11.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
know, and he did quickly apologize for those. That doesn't make as many headlines, and so I'm like, I was like, oh, how could he say that? I mean, I had actually spent my years in my anti-abortion activism. I actually spent a lot of that time holding intentional dialogues with pro-choice people. I mean, that's part of like what I try to do is build bridges. And I just thought, I mean, I got an award from before I left from the state organization of the Feminists for Life for being so inspirational to them. So, I mean, I was friends with feminists and people considered me a feminist and friends with pro-choice people. And so I was really mortified by his statement. Well, of course, I understood what he meant when he blamed 9/11 on the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and whatever it was that he said. I mean, I understood what he meant by that, but it still is not something, it didn't. It's a much more complicated theological point, even if you believe it, to stay in a
Right.
soundbite. And so that, but I kind of knew that's, where I had gone and who I had gone to. But over the course of my couple of decades teaching there, as I mentioned earlier, is where I got to know students, young people who grew up in this evangelical industrial complex, who were the ones who were reading I Kiss Dating Goodbye, and the ones who
Yeah,
were
that was me.
making the promise, the purity promise pledges and wearing the rings. And I just thought some of that was kind of weird. But I just, I'm like, okay, I also just, try to respect differences and think this is maybe they're right. But really, of course, so, there's all that is happening. But as with so many people, just, the support for Trump 2015, 2016 just made me stop and say, what is going on here? And I was there, of course, when Jerry Falwell Jr. came out with his endorsement for Trump that shocked everyone, right? I mean, it was shocking. It was shocking. um, there's for everyone, even the people who would later come to support Trump, I think they were shocked. And, and of course I had a lot of people asking, publicly and privately, like, what's going on here? And I remember Jerry's answer was that his first answer was that, that Trump reminded him of his father. And I just thought, well, well, okay. Well, I mean, that's not a good thing.
Right.
But on the other hand, I think I thought at the time, like he meant he's an entrepreneur. He's, daring. And I was like, okay, I can kind of buy that side of it. But of course, I didn't know how true, I guess, it was. And then, of course, we come to find out, Jerry Falwell had been leading this secret life that, made headlines. And so, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but I tried so hard. And my natural inclination really is to interpret everything as charitably as I can. I don't find that hard. It's natural to me, but it has actually become a vice. It's not a virtue. When you interpret things so charitably that you actually are blind to or ignore vices that are right in front of you and wrongs that are right in front of you. And so I don't want to overcorrect, but now I'm faced with like, what there's usually a pretty reasonable explanation for these things that don't make any sense on the surface. And the explanations are not good, right? There are reasons why people make these decisions and support the people that they do, right?
Yeah. And it's funny that you say that because one of the subtle tendencies in evangelicalism during that time prior to Trump was to kind of make our own space for things and build our own little complexes to interpret the world. And that was certainly true in the act. Like one of the things that I always think of this is I was in grad school at Fuller and I had a professor who was talking about the evangelical industrial kind of complex. And he was pointing out something. He was like, you ever notice how there's not very many commentaries on Genesis? And we were like, oh, really? There's not many commentaries on Genesis? No, we've never noticed this. But he's like, what? He's like, well, if you go and look for them in the library, you'll find 18 million commentaries on Paul. but you don't find many modern commentaries on Genesis. And that's because in the modern evangelical complex, for much of the 20th century, the idea was evolution is not true, creationism isn't true. And at my Southern Baptist church, we had classes about how evolution was really not working. It wasn't the best explanation for things. Here's why you need to be creationism. Here's answers in Genesis and Ken Ham telling you about how all this stuff really happened differently. And they created this whole little world for explaining how our way of viewing things was what was true. And you could kind of sustain that then because we didn't have the internet. So if you grew up just exposed to those materials, you kind of bought into that little world.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, of course, with the age of the internet, that crashes to a certain degree. I'm not saying it's like really gone, but like that ability to create your own little world, all of like you had all these things where you were taught, let's not believe maybe the simplest explanation for this. We have this other explanation that works. And that was the way we kind of were used to doing things. We listened to the evangelical leaders who we trusted, who were these moral paragons, but not even moral paragons. We didn't care so much that they were moral. We cared that they knew what was really true. Like they were the ones who knew what was really true.
Yes.
They had the secret knowledge. And we
trusted them. We
trusted them. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was this whole way of just, I think this is the biggest part of the evangelical complex, like, is just this idea of who knows what's true. The way we are saved is by knowing what's true. This person knows what's true, so we don't have to ask questions about who they really are as a person.
And so to go back to the beginning of this little story, the ripple effect then that's implied is it's dangerous to do the work on Genesis, right?
Yes, exactly.
Like especially if you want, like, oh, I don't want, let's just leave this
don't
one
support
alone.
that.
Right,
if you're working at an evangelical
that
institution,
fascinating. Just stay away from it because you might
just
not like
stay
what
away
you
from
see.
it because you might not like what you
Right.
see. And so we created these little bubbles, and we thought maybe it was what was true, but I mean, oftentimes it wasn't. It was just what we could portray as true. And I think that's the center of 20th century evangelicalism. Like our highest value was what we could portray or sell or believe was true. And that's that was the key to knowing Jesus, was knowing what was true.
And it didn't matter if it was good or beautiful, and you can't have any of them apart from the other, actually. But
I don't know how many times you've heard this where, like, maybe you've heard this at church as well. Like, he's a really nice pastor, but he doesn't explain the word like Tom does. Like it was like, like what was valued was, okay, we're choosing between two pastors. This one, he's really kind and he's really loving and he helps the kids feel really included. And this one, man, when he speaks from the pulpit, it's like God is speaking to me. So we're going to go with him. Or we're going to go to this church because this guy teaches on Sunday the best. And like that was even like, I couldn't even understand what it was like to go to a Catholic church where it was like, where the homily was almost an afterthought. And it was such a radically different experience. I didn't realize this till much later, to what like our highest value was on, could you speak well? Could you say it well? And not that, I mean, obviously speaking well and saying things well is good, but like that was our focus. And so then we believed it.
And then we just ignored or didn't put enough emphasis on other things.
Yeah. I mean, think about like all the major scandals are around things like this, like Mark Driscoll, amazing speaker, really great on his feet, really good at like getting out there and being kind of the brand of this way of seeing and speaking about the world. Doesn't matter if he's doing all this stuff behind the scenes, he's in charge. And Brian, I'm curious, like for you, I asked Karen this, when did you notice this? Like when did you see it? Did you see it a while ago? Did it take till Trump came around? Like, when did you notice?
I would say that I grew up in a time where when I got my undergraduate degree to go into ministry, I was encouraged not to get a master's degree, that the denomination or whatever you want to call what I was a part of, would refer to seminary. They would always say cemetery as kind of a tee-hee, but it was a real value statement. And I had professors at that undergraduate level who would talk about how, they saw a lot of guys lose their faith once they went on to higher education. And so So even though our denomination had seminaries at a grassroots level or at an undergraduate level, there was still an encouragement to not go beyond kind of a format where we learned this is, our dogma, this is what we believe. And so when I got out of Bible college, I remember one of the first things, I'm not related to him, but one of the first things I read was Bruce Metzger's a book on the canon of Scripture. And all of a sudden I had this kind of epiphany, this moment where I realized that the Bible didn't actually fall out of heaven, that it was put together by the church. And I was taught basically the Bible has all the authority, men have no authority. But then you're left with the dilemma of, well, then how did we decide on these books?
Yeah.
And somewhere at some point in our history, men actually did have authority to decide, what was going to be canon. And so from then on, and as I continue to read in academic literature, then it just started to erode a lot of those kind of dogma things that I had been taught, and realized that evangelicalism itself, as Karen was saying, is kind of built on just those preconceived ideas or those cultural myths that we continue to perpetuate and pass on to the next generation, more so than what we actually find is the best scholarship.
I remember another thing for me was going to conferences and here, like, a celebrity pastor would come in, and I would sometimes work behind the scenes. I used to do photography and other things, and I would hear people who worked in the Christian industry talk just kind of like about, oh, they're okay, kind of thing. Like, you would hear, like, they would talk about somebody like, oh, this great celebrity pastor, like, whatever, they're doing this thing, and they're like, oh, yeah, I mean, they're okay. They're kind of like, it's kind of like a big show. Or somebody was like, oh, man, I didn't really like the way they treated me. Like, there were things like that would happen that would just be kind of weird for somebody who grew up in, like, 90s evangelicalism. And you had these people that were so promoted as, like, God's messengers, as God's speakers. And then if you started to, like, talk to anybody working behind the scenes, it was almost like the majority of the time you'd be like, yeah, they're all right. Or you would actually hear something like this was like, that person is really actually really kind. And it was like a surprise to the people who worked in the industry, like how, like, good and nice and kind that person actually was. Whereas the majority of these experiences were experiences with celebrities, I guess. I don't know anyone else to say it. Like, you would experience, like, if you meet, a random celebrity movie star and they don't really have the time for you and they just kind of move on, like, which is the opposite of what you think of when you think of a pastor. A pastor is supposed to be there for their flock, to, like, be around and comfort people and be present. And then you meet these people who are really big in Christian circles and they're not pastors.
So so this is a question I want to ask Karen. So in your book of Evangelical Imagination, it's kind of like a tale of three evangelicalisms. There's a kind of a Victorian evangelical that kind of is the image that warms our hearts. This is who we are. Then there's the evangelicalism, sort of, we'll say, of the MAGA movement of, that has come to the forefront of the day. And then I would say there's also then just kind of maybe that evangelical industrial complex that exists even separate from those. How do we bridge a conversation with people when we're wanting to engage people as evangelicals about that evangelicalism we hold in our hearts versus the experience that we're having of evangelicalism today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think part of it is, I'm a word person, so words are important to me, definitions are important to me. And so I still think, I still use the term evangelical because it identifies a history and a movement and even a present, and also my own particular commitments. And so I haven't thrown the word out, but on the other hand, it will, if it hasn't already sort of reached its limits. So I think it's a descriptive word, not prescriptive. And so we don't have to, it ended up being such an important word because of the polling that was taking place and the headlines that were being written. And even the polling questions, in my research, it turned out that most of the polling questions, they would often ask one question for identification. Do you identify as evangelical or born again? So it's like one question that covers two overlapping but not identical categories, and it's self-identification. And so now that word has come to cover that. And so I think, for me, I just am evangelical, and I don't need to say it or talk about it except for when I come on podcasts, right? But I have those commitments, and so hopefully it will inform everything. It will inform the way that I vote, very much so, which is not the way, a lot of people, self-identified evangelicals, are voting. The way that I worship, the way that I share Jesus, the way that I hope that I bear his image in all of my interactions. And so I think that it's a word that has become kind of an obstacle. And so we have to think more about the meaning behind the word, think more about our theological commitments, our church commitments, and make those real in our lives and our conversations, far beyond whatever label anyone wants to put on us or me. Because as useful as labels are, they have limits, and sometimes words just run out of usefulness.
Yeah. Where have you, like, looking back, I've read some of your public, tweets and stuff like that, looking back on your career, how do you frame, like, when you look back at that work, do you believe, not for yourself, but at the movement as a whole, is it like, oh, man, they were just kind of lying the whole time? Or is it, oh, something has been transformed? Do you understand the difference of, like, was it always something it was not? Or are we living through an actual transformation from what was to what is now?
I still don't know the answer to that question. I think about it almost every day. And maybe it's both. History is so complicated. People are complicated. Movements are complicated. I think we can, look at, because I look, when we look back at, again, my area of expertise is the 18th century England. And we look back at the evangelical movement that started then. We have the Wesleys, who were passionately abolitionist. And then we have George Whitefield, who owned slaves, right? So even the forefather, somewhat reluctantly, I guess, whatever.
Jonathan,
And Jonathan Edwards as well.
Owned slaves.
Right. And so these cracks and fissures and inconsistencies were already there.
Right.
Are they absent from any movement? Probably not.
Yeah.
But they were already there. And so we are bearing that fruit, and I will say this. I was a Southern Baptist for 25 years. Upon moving to the South, I thought Baptist was Baptist, and I just thought, oh, well, we're in the South, so it's Southern Baptist. Silly me.
No, it's because they wanted to keep their slaves.
Yeah, and I kind of knew that, but coming from the North, I just thought that was over, that was past, that was history.
Yeah. Same experience.
And people, there are people who would tell me, like, no, you can't get away from those kinds of rotten roots and foundations. And I was like, sure you can. Well, and maybe the Lord can do it, but not without much more repentance and transformation than we've seen. And I bring up the Southern Baptist Convention just because it is the largest denomination in America. And so it's not all of evangelicalism, but it is a big chunk of it. Yes. And so, and it is, there's a great article, there's a few years old, by David French, and I don't remember where it appeared. It was before he was at the New York Times, but it was about Southern honor culture and shame culture.
I remember that article. Yeah.
Yeah. And so part of what he was saying there is that culture of the Southern Baptist Convention and the South is spreading more and influencing evangelicalism. And with it, the way a shame culture and honor culture plays out with certain issues. I can't do justice to it, but it's a culture that's spreading, is what I'm saying. So it has the rot hasn't been weeded out yet,
Right.
is what I want to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
funny you mentioned the shame honor culture spreading, because it made me think of, so not to get too attempting to be pop culture-y, but one of my favorite pop culture albums that everybody derided at the time was Taylor Swift's album Reputation, which I don't know if you've listened to, but
I don't listen to Taylor Swift, but I mean, not for any I just like I'm yeah,
it's now
I don't-
recognized. Yeah,
it's just
it's now
it's very poppy for me. So
yeah. It's now recognized as like actually pretty influential, because she kind of got it before a lot of people did in the 2010s, like how the culture was flipping in terms of it didn't matter what you did, it mattered what people said about you.
Oh,
Because
yes.
it was this whole, she's kind of been vindicated. It's kind of silly stuff, like it was pop culture battles between her and the Kardashians and Kanye, and people initially blamed her for some like phone call that people had, and they basically, for a while, she was like, they were kind of like, oh yeah, she's the lying, the cheating one, and then we learned, Kanye has some problems, and and they may have, looks like they were responsible for it, but the backstory of that was like her whole album is how it's about appearance, and how what people say about you is what carries. And this was before
Yes.
it came out, right as all the stuff was getting ready to happen with Me Too, all the stuff about cancel culture, before any of that had really gotten going, to where we saw this social media phenomenon, to where what people start to say online and the kind of way the mob catches onto a story, and that becomes the story and nothing you can do about it. Before that, people
Yes.
really understood what that happening. But I think social media, and that has contributed to that, is
Right.
where it's like it is what people say about you. It is your reputation. It is this honor,
Yes.
shame, like are
Right.
people, and Trump is like that to 11. Like all Trump cares about is, do you serve him or do you criticize him? So it's
Right.
not about
Right.
what's true. It's about who you serve and whether you're
And
making them
how
look
they
good.
make you look. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And so
Yes.
when I think I think about it as transformation, I think it was always there. Like, I think the celebrity culture part was always there, because I think American celebrity culture has had a corrupting influence, especially, like, I've been reading your latest book, and I think about that a lot when I think of 19th century evangelicalism to 20th century evangelicalism, is the move from a literate culture
Mm-hmm.
to a visual and audio, initially with radio culture, and the difference in what that like encourages in terms of the leaders that arise. And so we get to like a visual culture, and it's a preview of what we have now, but it's a change to where you're looking for what is aesthetically pleasing, what looks good, what sounds true, as opposed to,
What is true.
what is true. I like 19th century celebrities they were like either the pastors who did really well, they were like very accomplished theologians or very good rhetorical speakers, but were also usually very powerfully personally influential. And there's this weird 20th century phenomenon of, you can be very influential but not be personable, where like you can like alienate everyone close to you, but if you can perform well in front of a screen, you can get an audience. And I think that started there, but the social media domination of the culture is taking that to where it's flipping the culture. So I mean that's the way I think about it, but I don't know. I mean, I could be wrong.
That's helpful. Yeah.
What do you think? What do you look forward to about what's happening in Christianity right now, if anything?
No, I absolutely look forward to the results of this very painful reckoning that we're going through, but with it being able to see perhaps what we hadn't seen before, be able to shed some things that we shouldn't have picked up along the way. I say this in the evangelical imagination, I don't know. I mean, but this could be a moment that we're going through that is like a 500-year moment.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a 1,000-year moment. I don't expect to necessarily live through the end of it.
Yeah.
History will show us, the historians will tell us some things about what's is happening now that we perhaps can't see for ourselves in the moment. But I do think something will come out of this that will, whether it's a new there'll be maybe a new term that's applied to it, split. I don't want that necessarily, but we're already splitting over things. There are people,
Mm,
I was just saying to someone this morning, I said, that I thought there were people that shared the same values and beliefs that I do, and I've just come to realize that they don't. So I
mm,
need to shake the dust off my feet and move on. It's not even necessarily about right or wrong. I mean, I think it is that, but it's like, okay, we do not share the same beliefs and values. Let's face it and go from there.
Mm,
And a lot of us are doing that now. And the great sort, I guess it's one term that's
great
used.
sort.
So
Nice. I like that.
yes. Are you are you officially retired, or are you like in transition?
I mean, I don't know what to, I mean, I'm just working for myself. So, I mean,
Okay.
I do guest teaching appointments, but I'm writing and speaking. And so I don't, I don't have a full-time academic position. And so I'm just like the young people, I'm part of the gig economy. So yeah.
Living the
So
dream.
Yeah.
what do you want to see in your, like, what are your goals in your teaching, and maybe also because they're kind of different, like, the kind of commentary in the evangelical word versus your teaching career in English. They overlap a lot, I know, but where do you want in this next phase of your life, like, what do you want to see happen in terms of, teaching people about the wonders of reading in English, but also how that intermixes with your culture, your cultural and Christian kind of perspective?
Well, I guess at this stage, I was part of the evangelical industrial complex, and as much as anyone can be. And I probably still am somewhat, but more as a free agent. And so I just want people to see beyond the cultural trappings to what is really of Christ and what is of not. And I'm not someone who hates culture or wants to escape culture. I mean, culture is part of what it means to be human, and I love culture, even some pop culture. No, I like a lot of pop culture. I just like 90s music. So not
Me too.
that's why I don't listen. So it's not that culture is bad, but it's when we confuse culture with Christianity
Mm,
that we risk getting so much wrong. And so I think that
hmm.
is my particular call in this particular moment, is
Mm.
to not so much be part of the machine, but to show what is the man-made machine versus what is the truth of God that is eternal and
Yeah.
transcendent.
I like that. That's really good. I can definitely be on board with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's like this beautiful dream. Like I'm at an age and stage where I feel like I'm reaching my best by date very rapidly for my pastoral vocation, and I'm, thinking about, what comes next, because I'm not intending to I'm not independently wealthy, so I'm gonna be engaged in
Yeah,
something.
that's a reality as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that knot of our cultural identity or our cultural interpretation, if you could contribute anything to untying some of that, I think that's a huge thing and of great benefit, because I mean, I think you summarize it very well in evangelical imagination, that this is, I think this is so much at the center of a lot of our division, a lot of our differences, and a lot of the fruit that we are having to eat right now. And I would love to see more of that not get untangled.
I am also hopeful that there's some rejuvenation happening in some quarters right now, and it's not all. Some of it's happening in the extended MAGA universe, but I don't think it's all MAGA.
Mm,
I think there's a lot. There's one thing I'll say from my culture that I came from, and I think in part for you guys as well, is there was this thing, like, if we could somehow just be the most rational we can be, we'd all, like, we wouldn't have a need for faith. The world would make sense. Nothing would ever kind of like be controversial anymore. We'd all figure things out, and that would just be kind of it. And there was this thing of, like, the best explanation for things is not spiritual. And I don't think that's really true in the same way it was 20 years ago. Like, the kind of new atheist moment, I think, is kind of past us. And I think there's something where people are like, I think the spiritual and the metaphysical is real, not just in, like, a personal level. Like, we all think that as Christians, but the culture at large is not as enamored with the kind of secular humanist way of seeing the world, that has found that a little bit wanting and is looking for more spiritual things. I think we saw it first with the kind of rise of the spiritual, not religious in the 2000s and 2010s, but I think it's becoming more religiously directed, like looking for a program that is not just crystals and astrology, although I'm sure those are still, I think they're still going strong.
Big sellers.
Big sellers. But I think there is something there. We're transitioning to a different moment. And that was, I think, that was really a moment that was unique to the Enlightenment, to the, from the 1800s on, this idea of we could just, with our own human understanding of the world, unlock the clockwork of the world, and either there's a deity behind it or not, but we just, it's just kind of running on its own and we don't need much else. And I think that moment, really with the rise of first in science, with the rise of quantum mechanics and seeing how the universe is not as determined as we thought, but I think in lots of other areas too, I think we're moving to a different place, and I welcome that.
So you're declaring an end of modernity and the
I think
Yes.
I think modernity is ending. I think that's what a lot of what is happening right now. It's finally over. Postmoderns called it 100 years ago, but it wasn't ready to kind of give up its last breath. That's what I think. But my real question for you, Karen, is: are you going to see Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein?
Probably when it's streaming.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know that it's worth going to the theater for it, but it takes a lot for me to go to the theater. So
yeah, I'm the same. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to it. Go ahead.
I was just going to say before we go, I don't know how close we are to the end, but I did want to put in a word for late 70s rock and roll before we wrap.
Oh yeah, no, I was listening to The Who today on my run. So
there you go.
yeah.
There you go. So that was
there
the
we
best.
go. Modernity may be ending, but 70s classic rock lasts forever.
Forever and ever. Thank you, XM Radio.
Cool. Well, I do plan on going to see Frankenstein if I can convince my wife to go.
Right. Report back.
I will, and I'll be curious because that was my first 19th century novel that I really loved when I was a freshman in high school. I think it was freshman or sophomore. We had to read Frankenstein, and I was like, what is this thing? This is cool. So we'll see if it lives up to the reputation. Karen, I know you have to go, so I'm going to let you go. Is there anything you'd like to share or plug before you go?
No, I don't know. Yeah, just link to all my books on your website or whatever, and my Substack maybe. Yes.
We absolutely will. So go to Karen's Substack. We'll put that in our links. Also, your newest book is The Evangelical Imagination. Am I saying the title right? I don't have it right.
That is the correct title, but my newest book actually is You Have a Calling, Finding Your Vocation in the Good, True, and Beautiful, which came out in August.
Oh, okay. So we'll put that in our show notes, and you can see that and any other of her books. I encourage you to read them. They are very well written, and we're really glad you came on with us today.
Yeah,
so
thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.